The evening light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Keisha Williams' living room, casting golden shadows across the hardwood floors she had personally selected and paid for. She stood in her kitchen, hands wrapped around a ceramic mug that still held warmth from the tea she had forgotten to drink, watching the sun disappear behind the Atlanta skyline. The silence felt different tonight, not peaceful, but expectant, like the moment before thunder breaks the sky. At 30, Keisha had built more than most people dreamed of. The 3-bedroom craftsman house in Virginia Highland bore her name alone on every document, every payment, every decision. Her fingers traced the granite countertop she had chosen after months of research, remembering the satisfaction of signing that final paper. Home ownership meant everything to someone who had spent her childhood moving between foster families, never knowing which bedroom might be temporary. Marcus would arrive soon to pick her up for dinner with his family. The thought sent an uncomfortable flutter through her chest, the same sensation she used to get before foster family meetings, that careful balance between hope and self-protection. She had met Patricia Chen-Williams only twice before, both times in carefully controlled environments where conversations stayed surface level and smiles felt measured. The sound of Marcus's BMW pulling into her driveway interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she watched him check his appearance in the rearview mirror, smoothing down hair that never seemed to have a strand out of place. Even his nervous habits were precise, controlled. Everything about Marcus spoke of a life lived within careful boundaries, from his perfectly pressed shirts to his habit of checking his phone twice before answering it. Keisha gathered her purse and the bottle of expensive wine she had selected for tonight's dinner, a gesture that felt both appropriate and somehow desperate. She had researched the vintage, read reviews, wanted everything to be perfect. The weight of the bottle in her hands reminded her of all the ways she prepared for moments like these, over-preparing, over-researching, over-proving herself. Marcus's smile when she opened the door carried its usual warmth, but something else lingered beneath it. Tension, maybe. The same energy that had surrounded him whenever his family came up in conversation over the past 6 months they had been together. His kiss felt routine, automatic, the kind of gesture performed because it was expected rather than felt. The drive to Buckhead took them through neighborhoods that grew progressively more expensive, houses growing larger and more imposing as they climbed the hills. Marcus filled the silence with updates about his work at the family investment firm, his voice taking on the practiced tone he used when discussing business. Keisha found herself studying his profile, noting how his jaw tightened when he mentioned his mother's reaction to something, or how his hands gripped the steering wheel just slightly tighter when discussing family expectations. The Chen-Williams estate sat behind gates that opened with electronic precision, revealing a circular driveway and a house that belonged in architectural magazines. Every detail screamed of old money carefully maintained, from the perfectly manicured gardens to the subtle but expensive lighting that highlighted the home's classical features. Keisha felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one that came with entering spaces where she didn't quite belong. Patricia Chen-Williams answered the door herself, a gesture that might have seemed welcoming if not for the way her eyes performed a quick, calculating assessment of Keisha's appearance. Everything about Marcus's mother spoke of careful cultivation, from her silver-streaked hair styled in an elegant chignon to the understated but clearly expensive jewelry that caught the light just so. Her smile never quite reached her hazel eyes, and her handshake felt like a test Keisha wasn't sure she was passing. The dinner conversation flowed around safe topics: Marcus's work, the weather, current events, discussed with the kind of detached intellectualism that revealed education but avoided genuine emotion. Keisha found herself being studied more than included, Patricia's questions probing in ways that felt invasive despite their polite phrasing. Where did she grow up? What did her parents do? How did she afford such a lovely home? Each question felt designed to place Keisha in a category, to understand her worth according to metrics that had nothing to do with who she was as a person. When Keisha mentioned her engineering degree from Georgia Tech, Patricia's eyebrows raised just slightly, the kind of micro-expression that could be interpreted as surprise or skepticism. When she spoke about her work on the new MARTA expansion project, Patricia nodded with the kind of polite attention given to topics that held no real interest. The evening's most telling moment came as they prepared to leave. Patricia walked them to the door, her hand resting possessively on Marcus's arm as she spoke about upcoming family events, a charity gala, a cousin's wedding, Christmas dinner. Each mention felt deliberate, exclusive, phrased in ways that made it clear these were family affairs, not occasions for guests. As Marcus helped Keisha into his car, Patricia's final words drifted through the evening air with deceptive casualness. She hoped Keisha understood that the family had certain standards, certain expectations that had been maintained for generations. Nothing personal, of course, but family traditions were so important to preserve. The drive back to Keisha's house passed in heavy silence. Marcus seemed lost in thought, occasionally opening his mouth as if to speak before thinking better of it. Keisha stared out the passenger window, watching the expensive neighborhoods give way to her own tree-lined street, feeling the distance between worlds more acutely than ever. Standing in her own driveway, surrounded by the home she had built with her own hands and dreams, Keisha felt the evening's interactions settling into her bones like a familiar ache. She had experienced variations of this rejection before, in job interviews, social situations, even relationships. The specific details changed, but the underlying message remained consistent. You don't quite belong here. Marcus's goodnight kiss felt apologetic, though he offered no actual apology. His promise to call tomorrow carried the weight of someone who needed time to process, to figure out how to navigate between the woman he claimed to love and the family whose approval he clearly needed. After his taillights disappeared around the corner, Keisha stood alone in her perfectly manicured front yard, keys heavy in her hand. The house behind her represented everything she had fought for: stability, security, proof that she could build something lasting and beautiful. Tonight, for the first time since signing the deed, it felt like armor she might need to wear. The weeks following the dinner settled into a pattern that felt like walking on glass. Every step carefully measured, waiting for the moment when something would finally break. Marcus's behavior shifted in subtle ways that Keisha might have missed if she hadn't learned, through years of foster care, to read the spaces between words and the meanings hidden in gestures. Their usual Wednesday dinners moved from restaurants in Virginia Highland to places farther from his family's social circle. When Keisha suggested they grab lunch near his office in Midtown, Marcus suddenly discovered urgent meetings that required his immediate attention. The spontaneous weekend plans they used to make were replaced by scheduled activities that felt more like obligations than adventures. The first real crack appeared during a conversation about Thanksgiving. Keisha had mentioned looking forward to meeting more of his extended family, imagining the kind of large, boisterous gathering she had always fantasized about as a child moving between temporary homes. Marcus's response came with a hesitation that lasted just long enough to change the entire temperature of the room. His family, he explained, kept Thanksgiving small, intimate, just immediate family, really. A tradition his grandmother had started decades ago. Perhaps they could celebrate together another day, just the two of them. The suggestion felt like a consolation prize, offered with the kind of guilty kindness that made the rejection sting more than outright honesty would have. Keisha found herself remembering the group home where she had spent 3 Thanksgivings, ages 14 through 16. Mrs. Rodriguez, the house manager, had made sure all the kids had somewhere to go for the holiday, even if it was just the community center dinner for families with nowhere else to be. Even there, unwanted kids gathered around donated tables. She had felt more included than she did now. The pattern became clearer as autumn progressed. Keisha's sister Denise was getting married in spring, and the wedding planning conversations seemed to happen around Keisha rather than including her. Marcus would share updates, the venue, the color scheme, family members flying in from California, but always with the detached tone of someone reporting events rather than sharing excitement about experiences they would share together. Jerome noticed the change before Keisha was ready to admit it to herself. They met for their usual Sunday brunch at a soul food place in the old Fourth Ward, surrounded by families and couples who moved with the easy comfort of people who belonged exactly where they were. Jerome had known Keisha since their sophomore year at Georgia Tech, had watched her build herself from a guarded 19-year-old into the confident woman she had become. He read her moods like weather patterns. Keisha found herself deflecting his gentle questions, making excuses for Marcus's behavior that sounded hollow even to her own ears. Marcus was busy with work. The family was going through some financial stress with the investment firm. Wedding planning always made families a little crazy. Each excuse felt thinner than the last, but admitting the truth meant facing something she wasn't ready to confront. The breaking point arrived with an invitation that never came. Marcus mentioned, almost in passing, that his family was having their annual Christmas Eve dinner, 3 generations gathering at his grandparents' estate in Ansley Park, a tradition that apparently traced back to the 1950s when his grandfather first started the investment firm that had built the family's wealth. Keisha waited for the invitation that logic suggested would follow. Christmas Eve was still 3 weeks away, plenty of time to plan, to prepare, to find the perfect gift and the right dress for meeting the extended family. The invitation never materialized, but Marcus continued mentioning details about the dinner with the oblivious enthusiasm of someone who didn't realize he was describing an event from which his girlfriend was excluded. When she finally asked directly, Marcus's discomfort was visible in the way he avoided her eyes, focusing instead on folding and refolding his napkin, while he explained that the dinner was really more of a business event. Lots of talk about strategy and family financial planning. She would probably find it boring. Besides, her grandmother was getting older and didn't really enjoy meeting new people during the holidays. The explanation came with such careful construction that Keisha could see the architecture of his evasion, each reason layered carefully on top of the next, building a wall of plausible deniability that protected him from having to admit what they both understood. She wasn't welcome, and he wasn't willing to fight for her inclusion. That night, alone in her house, Keisha walked from room to room, touching surfaces and objects that belonged entirely to her. The dining table where she had hosted Jerome and other friends for countless meals. The bookshelf filled with engineering texts and novels that reflected her own choices and interests. The bedroom where she slept peacefully every night, knowing that no one could decide she didn't belong there. The contrast felt sharp enough to cut. In her own space, she was undeniably the authority, the decision-maker, the one whose comfort and preferences mattered most. In Marcus's world, she was something else entirely, a guest whose presence was tolerated but not celebrated, accommodated but not embraced. She pulled out her laptop and began researching, a habit that had served her well throughout her career and personal life. Knowledge was armor. Information was power. What she found about the Chen-Williams family filled in details that Marcus had never shared. Old Atlanta money, indeed, but newer than Patricia liked to pretend. Marcus's grandfather had built the investment firm from nothing in the 1950s, but the family's social status had been carefully cultivated over just 2 generations. The photos from charity galas and society pages told their own story. The family appeared at events that celebrated old Atlanta, surrounded by other families whose names appeared on museum wings and hospital buildings. Patricia wore her mixed-race heritage like an accomplishment, proof of the family's progressive values, while surrounding herself exclusively with people who looked and lived exactly as she did. In every photo, the family appeared perfectly coordinated, perfectly appropriate, perfectly aligned with the image they wanted to project. Keisha tried to imagine herself in those pictures and felt the same displacement she had experienced as a child when social workers would show her photos of potential families, and she would know, instinctively, that she wouldn't quite fit into their carefully arranged lives. The research confirmed what her instincts had been whispering for weeks. This wasn't about her personally, though it felt deeply personal. This was about maintaining an image, preserving a carefully constructed social position that depended on everyone playing their assigned roles. She was being cast as a temporary character in Marcus's story, someone who might be present for individual scenes but would never be written into the family narrative. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, delivered with such casual indifference that it took Keisha a moment to understand its significance. Marcus called during her lunch break, his voice carrying the forced cheerfulness of someone trying to make an unpleasant task seem routine. His mother was hosting a family dinner on Friday night, nothing formal, just immediate family and a few close friends. Would she like to join them? The invitation felt like a test she hadn't studied for, offered with the kind of reluctant courtesy that made acceptance feel like an imposition. Still, after weeks of exclusions and careful omissions, being included felt like progress. Keisha accepted, ignoring the warning signals her instincts were sending, choosing hope over self-protection in the way that had disappointed her so many times before. She spent Thursday evening preparing with the kind of meticulous attention she usually reserved for important work presentations. The black dress she selected was professional but not severe, elegant but not flashy, the uniform of someone trying to appear worthy of inclusion. Her hair was styled in a sleek low bun that wouldn't draw attention or comment. Even her jewelry was chosen for its ability to blend in rather than stand out. Friday arrived with the kind of crisp December air that made Atlanta feel briefly like the northern cities Keisha had visited for engineering conferences. She drove herself to the Chen-Williams estate, declining Marcus's offer to pick her up. Some instinct made her want to maintain her own means of transportation, her own means of escape if the evening required it. The house looked different in winter twilight, more imposing somehow, with warm light glowing from windows that revealed glimpses of elegant rooms and carefully arranged flowers. Other cars lined the circular driveway, expensive vehicles that spoke of the kind of success that came with family connections and inherited advantages. Keisha parked her reliable Honda between a Mercedes and a BMW, feeling the contrast like a physical weight. Patricia answered the door with a smile that was technically welcoming, but felt more like a mask carefully positioned for public consumption. Her silver hair caught the light perfectly. Her makeup was applied with professional precision, and her cocktail dress probably cost more than Keisha's mortgage payment. The living room held perhaps 15 people, all engaged in the kind of animated conversation that comes with shared history and common reference points. Marcus appeared at Keisha's elbow with a glass of wine, his own tension visible in the way he kept checking over her shoulder as if monitoring his family's reactions to her presence. Introductions were made with polite efficiency. Marcus's aunts and uncles, family friends who had known him since childhood, colleagues from the investment firm whose names carried weight in Atlanta's financial circles. Each person was pleasant individually, but collectively they formed something that felt impenetrable, a social ecosystem that had been functioning perfectly well without her and would continue doing so after she left. Conversation flowed around topics that required insider knowledge to fully participate in. Updates about mutual friends, references to events and locations that carried significance for everyone except Keisha. Jokes that relied on shared experiences she had no part in. She found herself nodding and smiling at appropriate intervals, playing the role of interested observer while feeling increasingly like an anthropologist studying a culture she would never truly understand. The dining room was set with formal precision. Each place setting featured china and crystal that probably represented generations of family history. Keisha found herself seated between Marcus's cousin David and a family friend whose name she had already forgotten, positioned in a way that felt both included and isolated. She was present, but peripheral. Invited, but not integrated.
The dinner conversation began safely enough. Discussion of the weather, recent travel, holiday plans that everyone except Keisha seemed to share. Patricia held court from the head of the table, directing conversation with the skill of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. Her stories were perfectly timed, her observations clever, but never controversial, her attention distributed among the guests like a hostess managing a performance. The shift began subtly, with Patricia mentioning the upcoming family vacation to Martha's Vineyard, a house the family had been renting for 15 years, she explained, looking directly at Keisha as she spoke. The same week every August, the same traditions, the same group of people who had been gathering there since Marcus and Denise were children. So important to maintain these connections, she continued, these relationships that span generations. The subtext was clear enough that Keisha felt heat rise in her cheeks. These were family traditions, established relationships, bonds that existed long before her arrival and would continue long after her departure. She was being reminded of her temporary status, her position as an outsider who might be present for individual moments but would never be part of the larger story. Marcus's uncle Robert shifted the conversation to business, discussing changes in the firm's client base and strategy. The talk became more exclusive, filled with names and details that required intimate knowledge of the business to understand. Keisha found herself completely excluded from this portion of the evening, listening to conversation that might as well have been conducted in a foreign language. When dessert arrived, Patricia's attention returned to Keisha with focused intensity. She began asking questions that felt designed to establish hierarchy rather than build connection. Where had she grown up, exactly? What part of town? Had she attended private school? What did her parents do for work? Each question stripped away another layer of the careful presentation Keisha had constructed, revealing the gaps in her background that separated her from everyone else at the table. Keisha answered honestly, because lies would have been easily detected by people with the resources to verify anything they chose to investigate. She had grown up in foster care. Her mother had died when she was 12. She had put herself through college with scholarships and work-study programs. Each admission felt like evidence presented in a trial where she was defending her right to exist in this space. The table had grown quieter as Patricia's interrogation continued, other conversations fading as people began listening to this more dramatic exchange. Keisha felt the weight of multiple gazes, the attention of people who were witnessing something that felt more like judgment than conversation. Patricia's response to these revelations was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut cleanly while maintaining plausible deniability. "How admirable," she said, "that Keisha had overcome such challenges. Really inspiring the way some people could rise above their circumstances." Of course, family background was so important in understanding a person's values, their perspective on life. The family had always believed that tradition and stability were crucial for raising children properly. The words were delivered with such careful politeness that they could have been interpreted as compliments, but everyone at the table understood their true meaning. Keisha was being classified as someone whose background made her unsuitable for permanent inclusion in their family. Someone whose history of instability might infect the carefully maintained traditions they worked so hard to preserve. Marcus sat frozen beside her, his silence more damaging than his mother's words. This was the moment that would define their relationship, the point where he could choose to defend her or abandon her to his family's judgment. His failure to speak felt like a physical blow, confirmation that her instincts had been correct all along. The final assault came as Patricia was serving coffee, delivered with the casual cruelty that only comes with absolute confidence in one's power. She hoped Keisha understood that this was really a family dinner, she said, looking directly at her target. Nothing personal, of course, but these gatherings were so important for maintaining family bonds. Perhaps Keisha would be more comfortable if she thought of herself as a guest rather than trying to insert herself into family traditions. The words landed with perfect precision, reducing Keisha to exactly what she had feared she was all along, a temporary visitor in someone else's life, tolerated but not welcomed, accommodated but not embraced. The silence that followed felt enormous, filled with the weight of expectations and the echo of rejection. But Patricia had made one crucial miscalculation. She had assumed that Keisha would accept this judgment, would retreat in embarrassment and confusion, would allow herself to be dismissed with the same quiet submission that probably characterized previous women who had failed to meet the family standards. Instead, Keisha reached into her purse and withdrew a folded document that she placed on the table with deliberate precision. The deed to her house, with her name printed in legal black letters across the top. Evidence of ownership, of stability, of the kind of financial responsibility that spoke to exactly the values Patricia claimed to cherish. The silence that followed was different from the earlier quiet. This was shock rather than expectation, confusion rather than judgment. Patricia's eyes fixed on the document as if trying to understand how it had materialized, what it meant for the power dynamic she had been so carefully orchestrating. Keisha's voice, when she finally spoke, carried the calm authority of someone who had found solid ground beneath her feet. If they wanted to discuss family traditions and stability, she was happy to participate. Her house was paid for entirely by her own work, her own savings, her own financial planning. She had created stability for herself that most people their age could only dream of. If being a guest meant not belonging somewhere, then she was grateful to be reminded of where she actually did belong, in the home she had built with her own hands and her own dreams.
The car ride home happened in a silence so dense it felt like a physical presence occupying the space between them. Marcus gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw set in the kind of rigid control that suggested he was using every ounce of his energy to avoid an explosion. Keisha stared out the passenger window, watching Buckhead's expensive neighborhoods blur past, feeling something fundamental shift in her chest, where hope used to live. They were nearly to her house before Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the careful modulation of someone who had spent the entire drive rehearsing his words. His mother could be difficult, he admitted, but she was protective of the family. The business had been struggling lately, and stress made everyone more sensitive than usual. Maybe if Keisha had approached the evening differently, been less confrontational, things might have gone better. The words landed like individual slaps, each one stinging more than the last. Keisha felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to fracture, 6 months of accumulated silence finally demanding to be heard. She had approached the evening by existing, by accepting an invitation to dinner, by attempting to participate in conversations from which she was systematically excluded. If that qualified as confrontational, then the problem wasn't her approach. Marcus's response revealed the gap between them more clearly than his family's rejection had. He began explaining Patricia's perspective with the patient tone of someone educating a child who didn't understand adult complexities. The family had worked hard to build their position in Atlanta society. There were expectations, traditions, ways of doing things that had served them well for generations. Change was always difficult, but it had to happen gradually, carefully, in ways that didn't threaten the stability they had worked so hard to create. Listening to him defend his family's behavior while simultaneously asking her to accept responsibility for their cruelty felt like watching someone she loved transform into a stranger. This wasn't the Marcus who had pursued her with such focused attention 6 months ago, who had seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences. This was someone who had been carefully trained to prioritize family harmony over individual dignity, institutional preservation over personal integrity. The conversation continued in her driveway, Marcus's voice growing more desperate as he realized that his explanations weren't having their intended effect. He loved her, he insisted, but relationships require compromise. Maybe they could take things more slowly, let his family adjust gradually to the idea of her permanent presence. With time and patience, things would improve. His mother just needed to get to know her better, to see past her initial concerns. Keisha felt something cold and final settle in her stomach as she listened to him outline a future built on her willingness to accept incremental tolerance, to be grateful for small improvements in the level of disrespect she was expected to endure. This was the best he could imagine for her. A gradual elevation from unwelcome guest to barely tolerated presence, achieved through her careful modification of everything that made her who she was. She thanked him for the ride home and walked to her front door without looking back, knowing that turning around would only make the goodbye more painful than it needed to be. Marcus called her name twice, but she didn't stop, didn't turn, didn't give him another opportunity to ask her to make herself smaller for his family's comfort. Inside her house, surrounded by the evidence of her own accomplishments and the security she had built with her own hands, Keisha felt the evening's events settle into her bones like a fever. She walked from room to room, touching surfaces that belonged entirely to her, reminding herself of the difference between being a guest and being at home. The contrast had never felt more important or more stark. Sleep came in fragments, punctuated by mental replays of the evening's most painful moments. Patricia's surgical precision in delivering humiliation disguised as concern. The table full of people who had witnessed her degradation and chosen silence over solidarity. Marcus's careful explanations that placed responsibility for his family's cruelty squarely on her shoulders. Each memory felt like a piece of broken glass working its way deeper into her consciousness. Saturday morning brought Jerome's predictable concern, disguised as a casual check-in. He appeared at her front door with coffee and pastries from their favorite bakery, armed with the kind of gentle persistence that had carried her through previous crises. He took one look at her face and settled in for what he clearly expected to be a long conversation. Keisha found herself telling the entire story, beginning with the months of subtle exclusions and building to the previous evening's devastating conclusion. Jerome listened with the focused attention of someone who understood that this was about more than just one bad dinner, that the patterns she was describing reflected systemic issues that extended far beyond individual relationships. His response, when it finally came, was delivered with the kind of gentle honesty that only comes from deep friendship and genuine concern. Marcus's family's behavior was unacceptable, but their cruelty wasn't the most important issue they needed to discuss. What mattered more was Marcus's response to that cruelty, his willingness to prioritize his family's comfort over her dignity, his expectation that she should modify herself to accommodate their prejudices. The conversation forced Keisha to confront truths she had been avoiding for months. Marcus had never defended her because he fundamentally agreed with his family's assessment of her suitability. He might genuinely care for her, might even love her in his limited way, but he didn't respect her enough to demand that others do the same. His vision of their future together was built on her willingness to accept a permanently diminished status, her willingness to be grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion his family might eventually offer. Jerome's questions were surgical in their precision, designed to help her see patterns she had been too emotionally invested to recognize. When had Marcus last initiated plans that involved his social circle? How often did he discuss their relationship with his family or friends? What evidence did she have that he saw her as a permanent part of his life rather than a temporary diversion? The answers, laid out in sequence, painted a picture that was impossible to misinterpret. For 6 months, she had been auditioning for a role in Marcus's life without understanding that the part had already been assigned to someone else, someone from the right family, with the right background, who would never challenge the careful hierarchy his family had spent generations constructing. The realization felt both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant accepting that someone she had genuinely cared for had never seen her as fully human, never valued her enough to defend her basic dignity. Liberating because it freed her from the exhausting work of trying to prove herself worthy of love that was never actually available. Jerome's presence provided the anchor she needed to process these revelations without drowning in them. He reminded her of who she was beyond this relationship, of the community she had built through her own choices and values, the friends who celebrated her successes without qualification, the colleagues who respected her expertise and judgment, the life she had constructed that didn't require anyone else's approval or validation. By Sunday afternoon, Keisha felt something she hadn't experienced in months, the solid ground of her own self-respect beneath her feet. The evening at the Chen-Williams house was designed to diminish her, to make her question her own worth and value. Instead, it had provided perfect clarity about the difference between being genuinely valued and being temporarily tolerated. Marcus called twice over the weekend, leaving voicemails that progressed from apologetic to frustrated to pleading. Each message revealed more about his inability to understand what had actually happened, his expectation that she would eventually come around to seeing things from his perspective. He loved her, he repeated, as if that fact alone should be sufficient to overcome his family's cruelty and his own complicity in it. Keisha didn't return the calls. Some conversations couldn't lead anywhere productive, and this was clearly one of them. Marcus lived in a world where love was conditional on acceptability, where relationships were subject to family approval, where individual dignity was negotiable. She lived in a different world entirely, one where respect was a prerequisite for love rather than a luxury that might eventually be earned. The house deed still sat on her kitchen counter, where she had placed it after returning home Friday night. Looking at it now, she felt the same pride and satisfaction she had experienced on the day she first signed it. This was proof of her capability, her independence, her ability to create security and beauty with her own efforts. No one could take that away from her, and no one's approval was required for her to enjoy it.
Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that sometimes follows emotional storms, when the wreckage has been surveyed and the work of rebuilding can finally begin. Keisha woke before her alarm, her mind already organizing the tasks that would reshape her life into something more authentic and sustainable. The weight that had been pressing against her chest for months was gone, replaced by the lighter burden of necessary decisions. The first call came from Marcus at precisely 9:15, time to catch her during her morning commute to the MARTA expansion project site.
His voice carried the artificial cheerfulness of someone who had convinced himself that enough time had passed for the weekend's unpleasantness to have faded into irrelevance. He wanted to take her to lunch, to talk things through, to find a way forward that worked for everyone involved. Keisha let the call go to voicemail and continued driving toward the construction site where her actual life waited, the career she had built through her own competence, the projects that bore her professional signature, the colleagues who valued her judgment and expertise. The contrast between Marcus's world and her own had never felt more pronounced or more important. At the job site, surrounded by the organized chaos of major construction, Keisha found herself appreciating the straightforward nature of engineering challenges. Problems had solutions that could be calculated, tested, and verified. Structural integrity wasn't subject to opinion or prejudice. When she designed a foundation, it either held or it didn't, based entirely on mathematical principles and material properties. Her assistant, a sharp young woman named Taylor, noticed the change in Keisha's demeanor immediately. There was something different about her energy, more focused and determined than it had been in recent months. When Taylor asked if she was feeling all right, Keisha realized that she was feeling better than she had in half a year, clearer, more centered, more like herself than she had been since she started trying to fit into spaces that were never designed to accommodate her. The second call from Marcus came during her lunch break, this time with a slight edge of frustration creeping into his carefully modulated tone. He had spoken to his mother, he reported, and she felt terrible about any misunderstanding that might have occurred on Friday night. Perhaps they could all get together again soon, in a less formal setting where everyone could relax and get to know each other better. The word misunderstanding lodged in Keisha's throat like a splinter. There had been no misunderstanding about Patricia's intentions or methods. The humiliation had been carefully orchestrated, delivered with surgical precision, designed to establish exactly the hierarchy that everyone present had clearly understood. Calling it a misunderstanding was just another way of asking her to accept responsibility for other people's cruelty. By Wednesday, Marcus's calls had taken on a different quality. The careful politeness was giving way to something more desperate, more honest about his own confusion and frustration. He couldn't understand why she was being so stubborn about this, why she couldn't see that his family's acceptance would come with time and patience. Everyone had to make adjustments when joining a new family, he argued. That was just how relationships worked. The word joining stopped Keisha cold. Marcus was still operating under the assumption that she wanted to become part of his family, that gaining their acceptance was a goal she was willing to work toward. He couldn't conceive of a scenario where someone might choose to walk away from what he saw as an opportunity, where the cost of inclusion might be higher than the benefit of belonging. Thursday brought an unexpected visitor to the construction site. Marcus Chen-Williams appeared at the security checkpoint just after lunch, asking to speak with Keisha privately. She looked younger and more vulnerable than she had at the dinner, her usual polished presentation replaced by something that seemed more genuine and uncertain. They found privacy in Keisha's temporary office trailer, surrounded by blueprints and project timelines that represented months of careful planning and coordination. Denise seemed fascinated by the complexity of the work, asking thoughtful questions about the engineering challenges and timeline constraints that suggested genuine interest rather than polite curiosity. The conversation eventually turned to Friday night's dinner, and Denise's discomfort was immediately visible. She had been thinking about the evening ever since, she admitted, particularly about her own silence during her mother's systematic dismantling of Keisha's dignity. She had witnessed something that felt wrong, but hadn't found the courage to speak up in the moment. Keisha listened to this confession with the detached interest of someone observing a problem that no longer belonged to her. Denise's regret was genuine, but it was also irrelevant to the decisions Keisha needed to make about her own future. The damage had been done not just by Patricia's cruelty, but by everyone else's willingness to witness it without objection. Denise's purpose in coming became clear as the conversation progressed. She was hoping to broker some kind of reconciliation, to find a way for everyone to move forward without the uncomfortable disruption that Keisha's absence would create. Marcus was miserable, she reported, and their mother was beginning to realize that her strategy might have backfired more dramatically than she had intended. The request felt familiar, in its assumption that Keisha's primary concern should be other people's comfort, that her own dignity was less important in maintaining the family's equilibrium. Even Denise's apology came with the implicit expectation that forgiveness should lead to renewed effort on Keisha's part, continued willingness to work for acceptance that might never come. Keisha's response surprised them both with its clarity and finality. She appreciated Denise's courage in coming to speak with her, but reconciliation wasn't something she was interested in pursuing. The dinner had revealed fundamental incompatibilities that couldn't be resolved through better communication or increased effort on anyone's part. Some gaps were simply too wide to bridge. Denise left the trailer looking more troubled than when she had arrived, carrying with her the realization that not all problems could be solved through family meetings and careful negotiation. Some decisions, once made, created permanent changes in the landscape of relationships, reshaping everything that came after. That evening, Keisha finally returned Marcus's calls. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes and covered ground that felt both familiar and strange, like visiting a place where you used to live and finding that nothing looked quite the same as you remembered it. Marcus's arguments hadn't changed, but her ability to be moved by them had disappeared entirely. He loved her, he repeated, with the kind of desperate insistence that suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. Love should be enough to overcome temporary obstacles, to bridge differences in background and family expectations. With time and patience, everything would work out. His family would come around. They just needed to see more of who she really was. Keisha found herself wondering what version of herself Marcus thought he loved, because it clearly wasn't the woman who had refused to accept humiliation disguised as hospitality. The person he was describing, patient, accommodating, willing to earn approval through sustained good behavior, was someone she had tried to be but could never authentically become. The conversation ended with Marcus's promise to give her space to think things through, delivered with the confident assumption that reflection would lead her back to him. He couldn't imagine a scenario where someone would walk away from what he was offering, a place in his life, however conditional, access to his world, however limited. The idea that she might prefer independence to inclusion, authenticity to acceptance, seemed to challenge everything he had been taught about what people wanted from relationships. Friday brought Jerome with takeout from their favorite Thai restaurant, and the kind of gentle interrogation that longtime friends are authorized to conduct during personal crises. He had heard through mutual friends that Marcus had been asking about her, trying to understand why she wasn't returning his calls or messages, seeking advice about how to repair whatever damage had been done. The conversation revealed how differently she and Marcus were processing the same events. While she was making peace with the end of their relationship, he was strategizing about how to fix it. While she was appreciating the clarity that came with authentic self-respect, he was consulting family members and friends about tactics for winning her back. Jerome's questions helped her articulate something she was still learning to understand about herself. The relationship had required her to become smaller, quieter, more accommodating than felt natural or sustainable. She had been auditioning for a role that didn't actually exist, trying to prove herself worthy of love that was conditional on her willingness to accept permanent second-class status. The weekend brought unexpected peace. For the first time in months, Keisha didn't spend Saturday morning wondering what Marcus was doing, whether he was thinking about her, how his family's various social events were progressing without her presence. Instead, she worked in her garden, preparing the soil for spring planting, taking satisfaction in the simple act of nurturing growth in something that belonged entirely to her. Sunday afternoon brought the final conversation with Marcus, initiated by his appearance at her front door with the kind of determined expression that suggested he had been building up courage all weekend. He looked tired and slightly disheveled, his usual careful grooming replaced by something more disheveled and human. He had been thinking, he announced, and he was prepared to make changes. He would talk to his family more directly about their treatment of her. He would set clearer boundaries about what kind of behavior he was willing to tolerate. They could take their relationship more slowly, give everyone time to adjust, but he wasn't willing to lose her over this. The offer might have moved her 6 months earlier, when she was still hoping that love could overcome systemic prejudice, that individual good intentions could defeat institutional racism. Now it sounded like another version of the same fundamental problem, the assumption that she should be grateful for whatever protection he was willing to provide, whatever modifications to his family's behavior he could successfully negotiate. Keisha's response was delivered with the kind of calm certainty that comes from finally understanding your own worth. She thanked him for the offer, but explained that she was no longer interested in relationships that required her to prove her value or earn basic respect. She had learned to distinguish between being loved and being tolerated, and she was no longer willing to settle for tolerance disguised as affection. Marcus's confusion was genuine and complete. He couldn't understand how someone could walk away from what he was offering, a place in his life, however conditional, access to his world, however limited. The idea that she might prefer independence to inclusion, authenticity to acceptance, seemed to challenge everything he had been taught about what people wanted from relationships. The conversation ended with Marcus's incredulous question about what she actually wanted, delivered with the frustrated tone of someone who felt he had offered everything reasonable and been rejected for incomprehensible reasons. Keisha's answer was simple and final. She wanted to be valued for who she was, rather than tolerated for who she might become. She wanted relationships built on mutual respect rather than conditional acceptance. She wanted love that didn't require her to shrink herself to fit spaces that were never designed to accommodate her. Standing in her doorway, watching Marcus drive away for what she knew would be the last time, Keisha felt something settle in her chest that had been restless for months. This was what peace felt like. Not the absence of conflict, but the presence of authentic self-respect. The solid ground of knowing your own worth and refusing to negotiate it away for temporary comfort.
3 months later, spring arrived in Atlanta with the kind of generous beauty that made the city feel like a promise being kept. Keisha's garden was responding to the careful attention she had given it through the winter, with early bulbs pushing through the soil and fruit trees beginning to show the first hints of blossoming. The work of tending growing things had provided a meditation on patience and faith that felt appropriate for this season of her own renewal. The MARTA expansion project had reached a critical milestone, with the first phase of construction completed ahead of schedule and under budget. Keisha's role in the success had been recognized with a promotion that came with increased responsibility and the kind of professional validation that reminded her why she had chosen engineering in the first place. Building things that would last, creating infrastructure that would serve the community for generations. This was work that mattered in ways that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Jerome had watched her transformation over the winter months with the satisfaction of someone who had always believed in her capacity for growth and change. The tentative, carefully modulated person she had become during her relationship with Marcus had gradually given way to someone more confident and centered, more willing to take up space and express opinions without apology. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday in April, delivered by messenger to her office at the construction site.
Heavy cream paper, expensive engraving, the kind of formal presentation that announced importance before you even read the contents. Denise Chen-Williams was getting married in June, and the invitation was addressed to Ms. Keisha Williams and guest, suggesting that someone had remembered she existed, even if they weren't entirely sure about her current relationship status. Keisha studied the invitation with the detached interest of an anthropologist examining artifacts from a culture she had once tried to join. The venue was predictably elegant, a historic estate in Buckhead, the kind of location that appeared in magazines devoted to Southern luxury and tradition. The guest list would presumably include everyone who had witnessed her humiliation at the family dinner, gathered now to celebrate the kind of union that reinforced rather than challenged existing social hierarchies. She placed the invitation in her desk drawer without RSVPing, filing it alongside other remnants of a life she had tried to build but ultimately abandoned. There was no anger in the gesture, no lingering resentment about opportunities missed or relationships severed. It was simply recognition that some worlds were never meant to be hers, and that realization brought relief rather than disappointment. The following week brought news through the kind of social media networks that kept Atlanta's professional community connected, whether or not direct relationships remained intact. Marcus had been seen at various events around the city with someone new, a young woman whose background aligned more perfectly with his family's expectations, whose presence at family gatherings would generate approval rather than controversy. The information reached Keisha through Taylor, who had heard it from a friend who had attended a charity gala where the new couple had been prominently featured at the Chen-Williams family table. The description of Marcus's girlfriend sounded like it had been designed in a laboratory to meet Patricia's exact specifications: private school education, family connections to old Atlanta money, the kind of polished presentation that suggested lifelong familiarity with exclusive social circles. Keisha received this news with something approaching gratitude. Marcus had found someone who could give him what he actually wanted, a partner who enhanced rather than complicated his family relationships, someone who fit seamlessly into existing structures without requiring any adjustments or accommodations. The arrangement would probably make everyone involved genuinely happy, which is the best possible outcome for people whose happiness depends on maintaining carefully constructed social positions. The spring months had brought other changes that felt more significant than the resolution of her relationship with Marcus. Keisha had joined the board of a nonprofit organization that provided engineering mentorship to high school students from underserved communities, using her professional expertise to help young people navigate pathways to careers they might not have known existed. The work connected her to a community of people who shared her values and understood her perspective in ways that had nothing to do with tolerance or accommodation. She had also begun dating again, though with a completely different set of priorities and expectations than had guided her previous relationship. The men she met through professional connections and community involvement were people who appreciated her accomplishments rather than being threatened by them, who saw her independence as an asset rather than an obstacle to overcome.
One relationship in particular had begun to show promise. David was a professor of urban planning at Georgia State, someone whose work complemented hers in ways that created interesting conversations about infrastructure and community development. He was also someone who had grown up in circumstances similar to hers, who understood both the challenges and the satisfactions of building stability from nothing, of creating security through your own efforts rather than inheriting it from previous generations. What struck her most about dating David was how natural it felt to be valued for exactly who she was. He asked thoughtful questions about her work, celebrated her professional successes without qualification, and showed genuine interest in the experiences that had shaped her perspective.
When she told him about her childhood in foster care, his response was empathy rather than pity, admiration for her resilience rather than concern about her background. The contrast with her previous relationship couldn't have been more stark. With Marcus, she had felt constantly aware of the gaps between her experience and his expectations, always working to bridge differences that his family seemed determined to maintain. With David, differences in background became opportunities for learning rather than obstacles to overcome. They shared values that mattered more than shared histories, goals that aligned regardless of the different paths that had brought them to this point. By late spring, Keisha had begun to understand something important about the nature of belonging. It wasn't something that could be earned through good behavior or achieved through sustained effort to modify yourself for other people's comfort. Real belonging came from finding people who valued the same things you valued, who appreciated the qualities you actually possessed rather than hoping you would develop characteristics you lacked. The annual performance review at work brought recognition that felt both satisfying and sustainable. Her supervisor, a woman who had built her own successful engineering career despite barriers that were all too familiar, spoke about Keisha's leadership potential and the importance of having diverse voices in senior management positions. This was validation based on measurable contributions and demonstrated competence, the kind of respect that came from proving your value through work rather than through acceptance of diminished status. Jerome noticed the change most clearly during one of their regular Sunday brunches, commenting on how different she seemed from the person she had been a year earlier. There was something more solid about her presence, more confident and settled. She took up more space in conversations, expressed opinions more freely, seemed less concerned with managing other people's reactions to her existence. The observation prompted Keisha to reflect on what she had learned from the experience with Marcus and his family. The relationship had taught her to distinguish between love and tolerance, between being valued and being accommodated. More importantly, it had forced her to confront her own willingness to accept less than she deserved, to settle for conditional acceptance rather than demanding genuine respect. June arrived with the kind of heat that made Atlanta feel tropical, and with it came news that Denise's wedding had been everything the family had hoped it would be. The photos that appeared in the society pages showed a celebration that looked like a magazine spread, with perfectly coordinated details and guests who seemed to have been selected for their ability to enhance the overall visual presentation. Marcus appeared in several of the photos with his new girlfriend, both of them looking comfortable and appropriately matched in ways that suggested this relationship would succeed where his previous one had failed. Patricia was prominently featured throughout the coverage, clearly in her element as the mother of the bride, surrounded by people who understood and appreciated the traditions she worked so hard to maintain. Keisha looked at these images with something approaching anthropological interest, studying the evidence of a world she had briefly tried to enter, but ultimately recognized as incompatible with her authentic self. There was nothing in the photos that made her wish she had tried harder to fit in, nothing that suggested she had missed opportunities that would have enhanced her life in meaningful ways. Instead, the photos reinforced her appreciation for the life she had built through her own choices and values, the house that belonged entirely to her, the career that reflected her genuine interests and abilities, the relationships that were based on mutual respect rather than careful negotiation of acceptable differences. This was a life that felt both sustainable and authentic, built on foundations that couldn't be shaken by other people's opinions or approval. Standing in her garden on a Sunday evening in late June, surrounded by plants that were thriving under her careful attention, Keisha felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing exactly where you belong. Not because someone else had granted you permission to be there, but because you had created the space yourself, with your own hands and your own vision of what home should feel like. The deed to her house still sat in her desk drawer,
no longer needed as evidence of her worth, but treasured as a reminder of her capacity to build something beautiful and lasting from nothing but determination and faith in her own abilities. It was proof not just of ownership, but of the kind of independence that made conditional acceptance irrelevant and genuine love possible. This was what freedom felt like. Not the absence of commitment, but the presence of choice. The ability to say yes to relationships that honored her full humanity and no to those that required her to diminish herself for other people's comfort. The solid ground of self-respect that made everything else possible, including the kind of love that saw her exactly as she was and celebrated, rather than merely tolerated what it found there.